abdominal cavity, this is the diaphragm, all right? So the diaphragm is the official split line between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. When we do the dissection, we're not going to make this cut that you see here on either side. We're just going to do straight down the middle, and then we just kind of using your hands will push the diaphragm down to detach it from the muscle wall. Okay, just a little more of the dissection. So now back to the membranes. For the thoracic cavity, first you need to know the pleural cavity and membranes. The membranes that you'll need to know are, again, associated with the lungs. When we talk about the visceral, it's always going to be the surface of the organ. So if we were to pin the lung and ask you for the layer, we'd be asking for the visceral pleura. Okay, so just the surface of the lung is the visceral pleura. Now the parietal pleura is the surface of the inside of the rib cage. So when you break open those ribs, you can often see that there's a really thin, shiny membrane that'll come off of that. In the abdominal cavity, you can see it right here. Can everyone see how that's nice and shiny? You'll see that same shiny membrane on the inside of the rib cage. That will be the visceral pleura. So if we pin the inside of the rib cage, then and ask you to identify the layer, which is the only thing we'd be asking if we pinned it there, the answer would be parietal pleura. Now the mediastinum, we would be asking in a hypothetical sense because it is the space between the lungs. If you look here, you can see that there's some tissue up here. We have our heart right here and then a vessel coming down. All of this space in between the lungs is called the mediastinum. So literally if we were to ask about this for the exam, the question would go something like, what is the space between the lungs? Okay, the answer is mediastinum. All right, next we have our pericardial, and again, pericardial is referring to the heart. Now the heart also has an inner and an outer membrane, but it's all contained on this surface. So I'm going to flip to the next view where they've actually cut this off, but here you can see that it kind of looks like it's wrapped in like a rough plastic. Okay, when you actually open up the chest cavity, you'll see that the heart has this membrane surrounding it. That membrane is the parietal pericardium. Now I'm going to switch views again. The cat actually flips directions, so kind of just here's the diaphragm, the abdominal cavity, the head would be over here. So right here where it has that 9 and this little membrane chunk right here, that's the pericardial, or the parietal pericardium removed. And then here we just have the surface of the heart showing. And that surface of the heart, if it was pinned and we were asking you to identify the layer, we would be asking for the visceral pericardium. Great. All right, now in the abdominal cavity, I'm actually not going to be talking about a few of these. I'm only going to be talking about the peritoneums because I really just don't want to get into the abdominal cavity today. We're not going to be doing anything today that involves going into the abdominal cavity. Okay, the only thing you need to identify is the two peritoneums, visceral and parietal, and these are pretty basic. You don't really need to dig in for this. So the layers in the abdominal cavity are going to be identified similar to how we identified the pleural membranes. So if we were to put a pin on the actual organ surface, that would be visceral peritoneum. So it's just the membrane covering each organ itself. For the parietal peritoneum, we'd again pin the inside of the abdominal wall. So you put a pin right here where you can see that glossy membrane covering it. And for either of these, again, we'd be asking for the layer. Okay, so if we're asking for any of the parietal or visceral membranes, we're going to be specifying this by asking you to identify the layer. All right, now the greater and lesser omentum and the mesenteries, we're going to cover more when we do the digestive system, but it's really important to note that you don't want to pull out the big fatty pouch in the abdominal cavity, okay? That when you open up the abdominal cavity, you're going to see that there's this big hunk of fat. It's actually a fatty membrane, and that's the greater omentum, okay? It's an organ, so don't pull that out. Just leave everything in the abdominal cavity how it is, okay? We're not going to be touching that. All right, so that's it for page 7. Any questions before we move on